This is class 3. Did you have any questions that came up for class 2? All right. So we'll move on to new material then. So what we're going to start using for the course is a short text that's written by or um, given by, I don't know if it was actually written down in the lifetime of Lama Tsongkhapa, but written by his own hand in writing, I don't know. But the text was originated by, authored by Lama Tsongkhapa. Lama Tsongkhapa is, we talked briefly about the four schools. We just mentioned their names, the four schools of Tibetan Buddhism. Lama Tsongkhapa is the founder of the Gelug tradition, which is the tradition that our center and FPMT, the international organization that we are an affiliate of, is specifically coming from. He is the person who packaged the teachings in such a way that became known as the Gelug tradition. He wrote many texts, and as a center that follows the Gelug tradition, a lot of those texts are seen as definitive in terms of commentaries that you would look to try to help you make sense of the sutras. So the short text that we will be focusing our discussions on is called The Foundation of All Good Qualities. Um, it's a 2 or 3 page text, and what its purpose is, it can be thought of as what's called a lamrim prayer, or it can be thought of as a glance meditation on the lamrim. So lamrim is now something that we're going to be focusing on as a way of understanding the sutra material of the Buddha. So lamrim, 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 it in English translates to the stages of the path to enlightenment, or the stages of the path to awakening. So what the lamrim tradition, and Lama Tsongkhapa did not invent the lamrim tradition. You could call it a genre of commentary, and really it's traceable to this person, Lama Atisha. You can see Lama Atisha's dates here, his birth and death dates here. He was an Indian master, an Indian scholar, an Indian yogi. He traveled to Tibet, and he saw a real need to kind of condense all of the teachings of the Buddha into something that could be transmitted, easily understood, easily practiced. So he wrote a text called Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment. And that's another relative. It's not as short as the Foundation of All Good Qualities, but it's a relatively condensed way of presenting every single major topic of what the Buddha did in all of his lifetime, in all of the different sutras, because it's quite difficult to look at these thousands of pages of sutra material where the Buddha, we talked about how the Buddha was traveling and giving teachings to the different people that appeared in front of the Buddha. And so, given that the Buddha traveled and gave these, teachings in front of different audiences, the audiences were in different places with their own level of understanding of the teachings, their own, because sometimes he would get disciples, people would travel with him, they would follow him. So some people would get more knowledge over time, other people were quite new. That he came across. So he had to explain all of these different concepts in different levels of complexity, different levels of sophistication. And sometimes, so you could imagine, as a corollary, you could imagine someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson is the example that I always use because he's a science educator, right? He also travels the country and he also addresses many different kinds of audiences. He addresses, first graders, high school students, graduate students, and then he addresses his peers also at conferences and so on. And he's explaining the same, couple dozen concepts of astrophysics to all of these different audiences, but he has to tailor what he's saying to a first grader, to a high school student, to a postdoctorate. So he can go into more or less depth, more or less complexity and sophistication. So if you were to transcribe all of Neil deGrasse Tyson's talks, you would be like, well, on Monday, you said this about the atom, you said this about how planetary bodies move. And then on Friday, you said this about the atom, and then this about how planetary bodies move. And it doesn't really seem like it makes sense. And he's like, well, I was talking to first graders on Monday, and then I was talking to, my peers at a conference on Friday. And so yeah, I had to kind of make it seem, not I couldn't go into that level of complexity with the first graders. So there's a danger when we are looking at the sutras that we might say, well, this doesn't really make sense with this, and so on, because of these differences in the audiences that were being addressed. The Buddha couldn't just say exactly the same thing, no matter who was in front of him, their level of um, familiarity, their level of education, and their general intelligence, and also their predispositions, what they believed going into that. He was trying to skillfully guide different audiences. So he had to tailor what he was saying to accomplish that goal. So the commentaries then are something that in Buddhism we rely a lot on because we have the benefit of these extraordinary masters like Lama Atisha, like Lama Tsongkhapa, who did read all of the sutras, but also they were able to discern the most sophisticated, most accurate um, ideas or presentations of these various topics, and extract that essence from this incredible body of work. And we benefit from that rather than having to try to make sense of all of these sutras ourselves. So the commentaries are something that are really heavily emphasized as a way of making sense for a layperson who doesn't have thousands and thousands of hours to, devote to all of the sutras. And even then, if you did, trying to on your own make sense of why this sutra makes it seem like this and this other sutra seems to be talking about the same thing, but it doesn't sound like it's being explained in the same way. So the lamrim is an effort to condense all of the sutras and not only condense them, but also put them in an order where, because as I mentioned, lamrim is the stages of the path to enlightenment. So the theory of the lamrim is that all of the teachings of the Lamrim are the teachings of the Buddha. There's nothing added, nothing taken away, but the essence is extracted from the sutras, and then it's presented as a step-by-step process for this is where you begin, this is what you do next, this is what you do next. And all of those topics, and it'll all make sense or more sense as we go through it. But the idea is that you're training your mind, you're preparing your mind for enlightenment in a very sequential, logical, step-by-step process. You're being guided through this is the best place to begin, then you do this, then you do this. And by training your mind in that way, you're setting the groundwork in your mind to have the insight finally that you need that culminates enlightenment in your own mind. That's the the theory of why the lamrim exists, why these great masters put it together. And it's really traceable to Lama Atisha's lamp for the path to enlightenment. That was sort of the first. And then after that, there's what are called 18 great lamrim commentaries. Lamp for the Path is one of them. Um, then the definitive rim text in our tradition is Lama Tsongkhapa's great treatise on the stages of the path, or the Lamrim Chenmo, or the Great Treatise in English. It's a 3-volume work. It's available now in English. It's accessible. It's written in a relatively accessible style. The chapter on insight, the last chapter, that's pretty dense, but otherwise it's generally, pretty easily accessible. My personal, people always, kind of ask about, studying Lamrim and so on. My personal um, approach, I would say first, it's good to just sort of read generally in, Buddhism, read books by His Holiness, just kind of read generally before studying Lamrim. But yeah, and that also Pabanka Rinpoche's Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand that you've got there. That's also a Lamrim commentary. Um, it's not my personal FPMT really likes that book. It's a absolutely valid, accurate commentary. I find it kind of heavy on the doom and gloom for my tastes. It's a bit heavy on that aspect. So it's not my favorite to start with. Because really it wasn't really meant to be a book, to be honest. It was given by Pabanka Rinpoche to a group of monks, or oral teachings that were transcribed and written down and turned into a book. So there was a cultural understanding, like in that room, that he was giving, and then we don't really share that same cultural understanding. And of course, some of that is unavoidable, because even the Buddha, he was, and Lama Tsongkhapa, I mean, he was in the 1400s. There are cultural differences, but in any event, I personally, as a first Lamrim book, I like um, um, the how to what's it? It's I don't know why I'm blanking on. It's it's what's his name? Oh, right, Yangtze Rinpoche. Is it practicing? Yeah, I don't know why. I got confused with how to practice Lama Zopa's how to practice, and Yangtze Rinpoche's practicing the path. So yeah, so Yangtze Rinpoche's practicing the path is a comment to modern day, because Yangtze Rinpoche is still alive. He's 50 something, 60 something. He wrote a commentary on the Lamrim Chenmo called Practicing the Path. And he really wrote it for a Western audience. So I like practicing the path. I mean, unavoidably, there are cultural kinds of issues with any, you know, Tibetan Buddhist anything, but in any event. Um, and then, I think reading the Lamrim Chenmo is certainly, a wonderful thing to do as well. And everybody at some point reads the Lamrim Chenmo. And if you really like, Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand, it's a wonderful book. I just find it, again, it's a little heavy on the doom and gloom. Um, but yeah, so Lama Atisha began this commentarial effort with lamp for the path to enlightenment. And then Lama Tsongkhapa came along. So you can see is hundreds of years later. Atisha's dates are 982 to 1054. Lama Tsongkhapa's 1357 to 1419. So hundreds of years later, Lama Tsongkhapa comes along and writes various Lamrim texts. The Lamrim Chenmo. He also wrote the middle length Lamrim. He wrote Songs of Experience. This text that we're going to use, Foundation of All Good Qualities. So the Foundation of All Good Qualities being like a 3-page text, in and of itself, it's not meant to teach a person the lamrim, because it really can't do that in 3 pages, right? Its purpose, really, it's something that people memorize. And it's really meant to remind a person of all of, that's why I called it a glance meditation on the lamrim. It's really something that people memorize, and and then they recite it every day. It's kind of, because it's only 3 pages, when you recite it, you're able to remember, okay, this is the progression. And so that's really its purpose, but we're going to give a little bit more, commentary on each of the verses for our purposes. But in and of itself, it just gives you these individual stanzas that don't really explain anything about what, because they assume that you've studied something else. They assume that you've studied the middle length Lamrim or the Lamrim Chenmo or something. And the purpose of this is just to familiarize your mind. So any thoughts or questions so far before we, no? Okay. So the Lamrim is organized into 3 scopes. This is talking about, I said that, that the Lamrim is taking a person step by step by step from the beginning all the way through enlightenment. So um, that process, the lamrim, can be organized into can be divided into these 3 scopes: the small scope, the middling scope, and the great scope, or the initial. Sometimes people will say initial rather than small. It just depends on how you translate whatever that Tibetan word is, which I don't know. So the small scope or the initial scope, these 3 scopes, they all have to do with the motivation of the practitioner who's engaging with the material. So the Lamrim itself is really for a Buddhist practitioner or someone who is taking it quite seriously, um, because even the small scope, or the initial scope, the motivation of that practitioner is someone who cares more about future lives than they care about the content of just this one life. They are more interested in their overall spiritual trajectory, kind of where they're headed, where things are going, um, you know, and using this life to set themselves up for good future rebirths. And by good, I mean, as compared to the worst, the kinds of rebirth that have the most overt kinds of suffering. They want to avoid those sorts of rebirth, and they want to accomplish the kinds of rebirth that are comparatively better, have comparatively less suffering on average, in general. So that is, compared to an ordinary, just regular person off the street, that's a really profound reorientation, because the average person is just kind of trying to maximize sensory enjoyment for the rest of this life. They're really just trying to avoid pain and get pleasure out of however many more days, years, decades they've got left before they die. That's kind of the general. And this person, a person on the small scope, isn't doing that. They are focused on, how do I use this life to set myself up for good future rebirths? So it's already, I mean, even just practicing the small scope is really profoundly spiritual as compared to, what you typically would find. Um, but then we are encouraged not to stop on the small scope. We are encouraged to progress to the middle scope of the Lamrim. And a practitioner on the middle scope of the Lamrim is a practitioner who understands that good future rebirths are still conditioned by suffering. We looked at those three when we looked at, that noble truth, the truth of unsatisfactory conditions. We talked about all pervasive suffering, meaning there aren't any actual rebirths that are truly completely free of suffering. There are some maybe that are better than others, just like we can say in this life, it's better to have food. It's better to have a roof over your head. It's better to be free of disease as compared to being homeless, being riddled with disease. Comparatively, one is better than the other, but neither is totally free of all suffering. Um, and so that is impossible within ordinary cyclic existence. So a middle scope practitioner is someone who understands that, who um, isn't seeking good future rebirths just for the purpose of good future rebirths. They don't see that as a good in and of itself. They've kind of matured out of that perspective that was prevalent on the small scope. They recognize that maybe there's a utility to good future rebirths. They allow a person to have relatively stable conditions, to have leisure, to have opportunity, to be able to continue to practice. Because if we take rebirth in really oppressive states, then practice isn't possible, right? If you are oppressed with, intense, really, really intense suffering, then trying to work on your mind isn't really open to you. You've got to have some stable conditions. So they see some utility to good future rebirths, but they also recognize that they're still marked with unsatisfactory conditions. So a practitioner of the middle scope is someone who's not attached um, to ordinary cyclic existence. They are focused on liberation. They are focused on um, no longer participating in cyclic existence at all. And so a Theravadan practitioner would stop here. A practitioner, from, who's practicing, and I mean, of course, there you can certainly find practitioners in Southeast Asian. So it's kind of a generalization to say, Northern Asian, Southern Asian, but broadly speaking, in general, the Southeast Asian countries are um, Theravadan countries, and they follow that sort of system where they have the arhat ideal. They're just seeking individual liberation. They don't have a great scope. They don't progress to the great scope. They stop on the middling scope. But the great scope is unique then to the Mahayana tradition. So for a Mahayana practitioner, what is really developed on the middle scope is a disinterest in ordinary cyclic existence. Um, again, seeing maybe some utility, seeing that there may be some necessity, but not having any actual attraction to it. Kind of like eating your vegetables, right? Maybe you don't really like your vegetables, but you understand that they have some utility, but it's not something that you're like craving. You don't, you're not excited about it. You're not doing it because it really, you see it as this amazing thing, but you're like, well, yeah, I see I understand kind of how there's value, and so I'll do it. Um, so they get like maybe it's necessary, but they are completely uninterested in actually, not seeking it out. It's not the goal. They're, um, but they're also not seeking individual liberation. They're also not, so that's not part of the middle scope for a Mahayana practitioner. It's more so just turning away from being attracted to ordinary rebirths. Um, and then on the great scope, again, which is only practiced in the Mahayana tradition, that practitioner is now um, focused on cultivating the meditative insight that directly gives rise to enlightened mind, which is to see the nature of reality directly. And they're joining that on the great scope with what their motivation is for doing that, which is called bodhicitta, which we've talked a little bit about, the mind of enlightenment, bodhicitta, the wish to achieve this enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. Now, those are concepts that we can familiarize ourselves with even starting right now. The concept of bodhicitta, that as an idea, that motivation is something that we can begin to cultivate even today. We can even today begin to kind of move ourselves towards greater and greater familiarity with the wisdom of what is the nature of reality. What does that mean? How do I kind of understand that more and more deeply? But when we say it's a great scope meditation, um, what we mean is that it's really on the great scope after having mastered the small scope, after having mastered the middle scope. It's really on the great scope that we would expect to have a real meditative insight, a real direct, very powerful meditative insight of both of those concepts, the concept of bodhicitta and the concept of emptiness, or the nature of reality, um, the wisdom that understands the nature of reality, because they really depend, as I said, it's called the stages of the path to enlightenment. So uh, those insights kind of can't really dawn in the mind of a person who hasn't done the work of the small scope, hasn't done the work of the middle scope. They prepare the ground for those insights. And really, the small scope prepares the mind for the middle scope, and then the small scope and the middle scope combined prepare the mind for the great scope. Even though it's certainly true that, people can take these meditations and start thinking about them, even start integrating them. Um, but there is an understanding that you have to really master the small scope and you have to really master the middle scope. And then once you've done that, then you can really truly master the great scope. And so you do have to progress in this way. Any thoughts or questions?
I lost you. So as they progress, is this just in one direction, or is it kind of a cyclical where you come back to it? Maybe you kind of reach some of it, now you got to go back, maybe go forward.
Um, so I would say, in a way, how a person approaches their own practice of the lamrim, I think, is very individual. It's certainly possible to kind of say that I'm going to start with the first meditation on the small scope, and I'm not going to do anything other than that until I've had a real realization of that first topic. And then I'm going to go on to the second topic of the first scope, and so on. So you're really not, you're not going through any of the other things. You're really going one by one by one by one. Um, and some, in the monasteries, they may, some people, they may take that approach. Um, I think for a lot of people, that can there is necessarily repetition that's involved in this process. I mean, there's no way around the idea that um, we do have to keep coming back. It's not like, the very first topic we're going to master in a short period of time. This is not a quick kind of process. But when a person approaches it like that, the repetition for a lot of Western people, I think it can be too much. It can be like, the idea of just, I'm going to spend 3 years or 5 years on this topic and then 3 years on the next. That might be too much repetition of the exact same thing. So what Lama Zopa has recommended in the past, he's the spiritual director he was the spiritual director of FPMT. His advice was to cycle through, as you're kind of saying, to cycle through the lamrim kind of once every year. So there's maybe 15 or so major topics of the lamrim as a whole. So a person could take the first topic and do that every day for a month. And then they could do the next topic every day for a month. Uh, and then cycle through about once a year like that. And then maybe a person does that for a year or two, and then the next after that, maybe they spend 2 months on each topic, and they go a bit more slowly the next time they cycle. That kind of strikes a balance between repetition, but also like keeping it a little bit more fresh. Like, it can be a bit much to say, for a whole year, I'm only going to do the one topic. Now, within the one topic, any of these topics, any of these 15 topics, a person can generate 5, 10 different individual meditations, ways of coming at that topic, ways of like exploding different parts of it. Um, so it isn't like you're literally doing just one exact same meditation every day. You can come up with 10, maybe 15 in some cases, ways of thinking about and looking at different angles of that topic. Um, and I do think that it is true that a person gets an appreciation of earlier topics on the basis of their familiarity with later topics. I think that they do I think that does happen. But I think it's unavoidably true that it, it isn't necessary, that a person might not, they might literally just study them one by one and master them. And then I still think that because this idea of mastery has different ways of understanding it too. Um, Ultimately, we'll talk about this idea of fully qualified calm abiding, or shamatha, shine, fully qualified calm abiding, which is a meditative skill that practitioners also try to develop. And one way of thinking about this idea of realizing lamrim topics is having fully qualified calm abiding. So without fully qualified calm abiding, um, there is a difference with what the idea of realizing that topic kind of means. So some people will actually start with fully qualified calm abiding and really try to generate that skill before studying the Lam Rim in detail at all. That's like the first thing that they will do. Um, so, and that takes years and years as well. Even, if it's even possible. I mean, it's quite difficult. Um, but so, um, but yeah, I think it's more palatable. I would say for most people, the most palatable way of approaching it is to try to keep it fresh by cycling in some way. Okay. So now we'll talk about the four features of the Lamrim. So this is kind of four advantages to studying not just like all of these sutras, but really taking advantage of the Lamrim tradition that we're benefiting from, and how what are the advantages of presenting the Lamrim in this way, as opposed to just, again, studying on your own. So the first benefit is this understanding that the practitioner generates that none of the teachings contradict any other teaching, which is kind of what I was alluding to in the beginning. When we understand, oh, well, the Buddha said, he said this for this audience, he said this for that audience. And so, for a practitioner of the small scope, you could say, well, it's kind of contradictory to say that at some point a person is seeking good future rebirths, and at a different point, you're seeking liberation. Why not just seek liberation? Well, because, the idea is that you may really need good future rebirths. And for some people, we may be able to not see them as a good in and of themselves, even from the beginning. But some people they really believed that they were, and so they had to be guided, some from the sutras, like they came, from the Vedic tradition, the existing, and maybe they really were convinced that good future rebirths was like all that there is, and that was the predisposition they had in their mind. The Buddha kind of had to work with that. Be like, yeah, that's great. Do that. And then later, when their mind was more advanced, then he gave them middle scope teachings and helped them to see. But still, even for a person who is aspiring to the great scope, we can see that we should do the things that are going to create good future rebirths, because we're going to probably need those good future rebirths to finish practicing the path. We're probably not going to finish just in this one lifetime. So we're setting ourselves up for success with that. Um, so we can understand that the Buddha was skillfully leading everyone and not kind of just dogmatically, telling everyone, to do one thing. Um, so the second advantage is that we come to understand that there isn't anything that in any teaching that the Buddha presented that's just kind of like, oh, that's interesting, or oh, that's you know, yeah, kind of like just a factoid that the Buddha was throwing out there. Everything has a point. Everything is, all of these teachings, we have to understand that everything that the Buddha taught was really meant for one practitioner over the course of their spiritual evolution. It isn't all that was what they would say is that was the Buddha's final intent. His final intent was, yes, he had to say this to guide this person. Yes, he had to say this to guide that person. But finally, in the, what he was hoping, what he was trying to accomplish was that everyone would achieve enlightenment. Everyone would get to the great scope. So there's nothing that the Buddha taught that isn't applicable for one's own practice. There's nothing that doesn't have a place in one's own practice as one is striving for enlightenment. He never just kind of threw something out there. Okay. Any thoughts about? Oh. And so then this idea of the threefold path, there's two ways of understanding the threefold path, and they both relate to the structure of the lamrim. One is what we just talked about, the small scope, middle scope, and the great scope. That's one way of talking about the threefold path. And then the other way of talking about the threefold path is um, the content of the lamrim, what are these three paths generating? What are the realizations that they're generating in the mind? And those realizations are called renunciation, bodhicitta, and then the correct view of the nature of reality. Those are the three outcomes of studying the lamrim. Um, Renunciation is really begun on the small scope, because a person is turning away from all of the negative actions that would give rise to lower realm rebirths. And that's a form of renunciation. It's not a complete practice of renunciation, but it's the beginning of renunciation. And then that practice is deepened on the middle scope, where a person is turning away even from actions that, give rise. Again, it depends. Even, for a Theravadan practitioner, they're trying to not give rise to any actions that give rise to cyclic existence at all. Or at least for a Mahayana practitioner, they're trying to do that in a way where their aim isn't to create. They kind of unavoidably, you can't, because you haven't had a direct realization of the nature of reality. So even your constructive actions are still mixed with ignorance. So it's kind of unavoidable, but um, you're not in a really attached kind of craving way pursuing intentionally um, rebirths within cyclic existence. We can kind of say it like that. So did I skip any? No, okay. Okay, and then the fourth advantage or feature of the lamrim is that the teachings are protected from the fault of abandoning the Dharma. So this kind of goes back to understanding that everything that the Buddha taught is guiding a single practitioner all the way through their spiritual journey. And what this means is we don't denigrate the small scope, we don't denigrate the middle scope, because we understand that I myself, even if I aspire to the great scope, I can't skip the small scope. I can't skip the middle scope. I have to engage in all of these practices. They all have a role to play in my own spiritual growth and development, even if it's true that I myself aspire to being a great scope practitioner. So we don't say, well, yeah, he only said that for Theravadins. He only said that for, these other practitioners. He didn't really mean that for me. We understand, that. So another way of talking about these three scopes is to say that as a Mahayana practitioner, we engage in the practices that are held in common with practitioners of the small scope. We may not be a practitioner of the small scope, but we engage in the practices that are held in common with practitioners of the small scope. We may not aspire to be a middle scope practitioner even, but we still have to engage in the practices that are held in common with practitioners of the middle scope. And then we aspire to the great scope, and we hope to prepare the mind to achieve and to master the great scope. Okay. Any thoughts or questions about anything that we've covered? Okay, so we'll start then looking at the small scope. And again, the purpose of the small scope is to achieve freedom from the lower realms, achieve freedom from the rebirths where the suffering is the greatest, where the suffering is the most oppressive, the suffering is the most intense, because these are the kinds of rebirths where it's the most difficult to engage in spiritual practice. So we really need to avoid creating the karmic seeds in our mind that would generate these sorts of experience. Okay, so we're going to then look at these verses from the foundation of all good qualities. So the first verse, and technically, technically in the lamrim, you'll often find that the way that they structure it is to put this teaching kind of before they start actually talking about the small scope in a technical sense, because the first teaching is on what's called guru devotion, or how to correctly relate to the spiritual guide. And that wisdom, the wisdom that's contained in that teaching, is applicable to all of the scopes. Um, so in a way, it's actually not part of the small scope because it really has nothing to do with freedom from the lower realms. It's kind of a precursor to it's equally important at all, for all practitioners. You never abandon or you never don't apply the wisdom of how to correctly relate to the spiritual guide or the guru. So that is the topic. That's the first topic, how to correctly relate to the spiritual guide. Um, okay. So this is a difficult topic for the Western mind, this idea of having a spiritual guide, having a guru. Um, but it is presented as it's an important part of Tibetan Buddhism, this idea of um, creating a personal relationship with a really highly qualified spiritual guide. Um, in the same way that if we want to do anything, really, this is something that we kind of understand. If we want to be an engineer or a doctor or a, a lawyer or a plumber, we seek out people who have done that, and we do that in college or in trade schools or in graduate schools or, whatever, or apprenticeships and so on. We come under the influence of those people, right? And we don't say, oh, well, I already know how to be a doctor. I already know how to be a plumber or a surgeon or an accountant or whatever it might like, because we don't. We recognize this is something I would like to do, but I have no idea what really, what does a neurosurgeon do? What does an accountant? I really don't know. But there are surgeons, there are accountants. And so we seek out those people and we listen to them and we take what they have to say seriously and we apply and we don't argue with them. We don't say, no, you don't actually know what it means to be what you are. And you don't, we try to find the most qualified, whatever it is. And then we really listen to attentively, we apply. And that's really all we're talking about. We want to achieve enlightenment. So we try to seek out people who ideally are enlightened. And, if we're not sure, at least we know that they have, they've practiced, they've studied, they have a lot of knowledge to give us. And then we generate this really respectful attitude toward them. And we don't denigrate them, we don't argue with them, we don't fight, we don't, think negatively, we hold them in a high esteem. We cultivate a great deal of respect for that relationship. Um, and so, I think it's a double-edged sword in the sense that this also is something that creates a lot of anxiety, with new students, not only, what does that look like, but also I don't, thinking, oh, but I don't have that, and that sounds quite difficult. Um, so I think it's also true that we live in a time and a place that is also in some ways different than 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years ago, there was nothing other than physically going to where someone was speaking and being in their presence and hearing their words and then trying to maintain that. And now we've got books, we've got, videos, we've got we have access to so many more resources. So I do think it's absolutely true that, a person can, on their own, make a good deal of progress in self-study and so on. But there comes a point, there does unavoidably come a point where we need to have guidance. We need to recognize that I'm not enlightened. I don't know all of these things and I can't do it all by myself. I need to get feedback. I need to get, am I on the right track? This is my experience in meditation. Is this, does this make sense? Does it seem like I'm progressing in my practice? And we need to get that kind of feedback from someone. So creating these relationships is quite important. Is it is it critical on day one? No, I don't think that it is. But so we can be relaxed about it. But there does come a point where we, in order to continue to progress, it becomes necessary. Um, yeah. So that's and of course the word him here is just to this was again, it's 1,000 years ago. And so um, at that time, there really were no female teachers. Now there are many very, very highly qualified female teachers. So it doesn't, a person's guru absolutely can be female. It's just that wasn't common at all at the time. So your guru can certainly not be it doesn't have to be a male guru at all. Any questions about how to properly rely on the spiritual guide?
How does that relationship come about? Is it just through the classes, or is it?
I mean, so it's certainly it comes, from the side of the student. The student has to decide, and so there's a process where um, just going to teachings, just listening to people, that doesn't create this relationship, this kind of specific relationship that's being talked about here, where a person is really looking for personal guidance from that. They're just like, oh, this Lama is, they're in town, and so I'm going to go. I'm going to go listen to what they have to say. That's totally fine, and that's great. Um, at a certain point, a person, as you're saying, by like taking classes, they're like, oh, this person is really making a lot of sense to me. And the way that they talk, the way that they explain things, it really resonates with me in a way that maybe I've been to other teachings and they're not resonating in the same way. This person seems to be connecting with me. Um, so then from the side of the student, that person might think about that person as, oh, this is someone that can really guide me. This is someone I feel like I would like to create that relationship with. And then you start really pursuing that in a deeper way. And at a certain point, you could certainly go to that person and be like, would you take me on as a student? Would you be my root teacher? That's certainly something that you could do. Um, and then, in a more technical way, there's also of quite sort of this idea of a root guru and then sort of other gurus. The root guru, because a person can have many teachers, a person can have many, gurus. They may study this topic with this person, a different topic with a different person based on their expertise or their speciality. Um, but um, if a person, there is an understanding that if a person takes vows from someone, then that person does become one of their teachers. So that's something to keep in mind, because you're meant to generate, from your side, if you've taken someone as a teacher, you're meant to, again, as it says here, really cultivate this mind of, respect and devotion and appreciation. So you should try to investigate if you're thinking about taking delay vows from someone, not just be like, oh, this random person is here and they're offering it, but to like really make sure that you feel comfortable relating to them. You may never see them again, right? They may literally have just come into town and, you may travel and you may get the vows and you may never see them again or talk. But if you hear later that maybe they had some what seems like an ethical transgression, or then, you know, how can are you confident that you can still have this respectful attitude? Because we're really meant to. We're meant to see a teacher in this really respectful way, even if they seem to have faults, even if they seem to have, so that, we have to feel confident that we can engage in that training. So that means, and of course, there's no way to really be 100% sure that this person, there are historical examples of highly respected teachers who, it's thought that it's presented that there were ethical lapses, that there were actions that people, that caused harm to other people. But their students, they're kind of still obligated to, they may not regard them as their teacher anymore. They may kind of step back from that relationship, but they're obligated to not denigrate them. They're obligated to not, go around telling, saying awful, disrespectful, things about them. They can kind of step back and be like, well, maybe I can't be guided by this person anymore. They're not benefiting my mind. But so, in that way, that's not necessarily coming from the student. That's coming from the vows and the relationship that the vows have created between the student and the teacher. That's a little bit different in terms of, but here, really, what we're also talking about is the root guru, the person who moves your mind the most, the person that, really you have the greatest degree of confidence in as being, this is the person that I can rely on to lead me to enlightenment. This is the person that I have really unshakable confidence that they have the qualities to, to take me to enlightenment. Um, and then that person might pass away, and then you might, have a different, that role might be filled by a different person if that person is no longer like alive, for example. Um, and then a person can have sort of secondary teachers and so on as well. But but yeah, it's coming from the side of the student and not like something that's forced upon someone in any stretch of the imagination, because a person might be a qualified teacher, but that doesn't mean that they are a root guru for all people. That doesn't make them, Lama Zopa Rinpoche. Many people took Lama Zopa Rinpoche when he was alive as their root guru. But that doesn't mean that every person had the right kind of karma to take they might have a different person who for them had explained things in a different way, had a different temperament, used, had a different just kind of mannerisms. And for their mind was moved better by that other person. Doesn't mean that Lama Zopa is not a valid teacher. They're both valid teachers, but not everyone has the karma to relate to all valid teachers in the same way. So we decide who that is. Okay, so then the second verse, and this is sort of technically again, in a way, the first piece of wisdom related to just this idea of closing the door to the lower realms. Um, so this topic is on what's called precious or perfect human rebirth. And there's a number of different parts to this idea of perfect human rebirth, precious human rebirth. Um, so you can see here it says, understanding that the precious freedom of this rebirth is found only once, is greatly meaningful and difficult to find again. Please bless me to generate the mind that unceasingly, day and night, takes its essence. So I mentioned that this can be called a lamrim prayer because you find that, these verses, they end in this sort of, you know, request, please, and you're requesting the Buddha, you're requesting the mind, the Buddha's mind to help you generate these realizations. Um, okay, so here, it says, the precious freedom of this rebirth. So that's what we're going to start with. We're going to unpack all of these phrases in this verse. So the freedoms of this precious human rebirth that we are in possession of, the freedoms are disadvantageous states that we could be experiencing, but we are free from. Um, these are harmful things, negative things that are not in this moment are not characterizing the experience that we're having. They don't characterize the kind of life that we're experiencing. So we'll go through these. So we presently have taken a rebirth that is not in one of these four realms, the hell realm, the spirit realm, the animal realm, or the celestial realm. So these are negative states where we don't want to take rebirth and we haven't taken rebirth. At present, we're not experiencing these experiences. So these are other, and realm here refers to the body as well as the environment of these different ordinary sentient beings. So we are humans, so we are in the human realm. So our mind is presently associated with a human body. And as a human, because we have a human body, we live on a planet that's suitable for human life. So this body, this physical environment is the human realm. There are sentient beings that are in what in English, unfortunately, is called the hell realm. In Tibetan, it's called Narak, which is just the state of being unfree. But in English, they decided to kind of use a Judeo-Christian term, which isn't great, but we're stuck with this idea of the hell realm. Now, it is true that there are similarities, which I think is quite interesting, that there are similarities between the way that this realm is described and a lot of the kind of similarities that you find in Christianity and in Judaism, and even in, the other theistic traditions that also have this kind of concept. I think it's interesting, maybe, that there were meditators, in all of these spiritual traditions that had memories of this sort of experience. And so it kind of seeped into, I think maybe sort of seeped into all of these spiritual traditions in similar ways. So the beings who are experiencing this realm are incredibly oppressed by suffering. It's they the rebirths in this realm are incredibly long, um, billions and billions or trillions of Earth years as an arbitrary way of thinking about it. Um, and during the length of that experience, the kinds of overt physical sufferings and mental sufferings that they are experiencing are extraordinarily intense. Um, so that is a type of existence that the Buddha presented as something that does exist within reality as a whole. And the teachings, would say that many times in the past, the mind that's having this experience right now had that kind of experience. And it's just not right now because of the karma that ripened to have this experience. So it's quite fortunate that we're not presently experiencing that. So then the spirit realm is also called the realm of the hungry ghosts in English, again, in this translation of a Tibetan phrase. This is another type of form, a sentient being form, where it's also the lives are quite long, and the experiences that are had by these beings are one of the drives of hunger and thirst. That is the predominant experience. Intense hunger, intense thirst that's never really satisfied. Um, and that kind of just persists throughout the experience of these beings. That's why they're called hungry ghosts. That's sort of their whole existence is just this overwhelming hunger and thirst and inability to really do anything about it. And so there are karmic causes of these different realms. The kind of most intense negative karmas are the ones that generally give rise to the hell realm kind of rebirth. And then what they would say is that the energy, the kind of karmic energy of intense craving and intense attachment, is the sort of energy that manifests as this hungry ghost realm. Right? That's sort of the, because that sort of energy was in the mind, that's the sort of form that that energy manifested in, that experience, that sort of dissatisfied mind, always wanting more, always wanting, never being satisfied. That energy can give rise to this experience. Whereas the energy of, the mind of, murder, the mind of, intense torture, wanting to inflict torture, that kind of energy, when that's present in the mind, that can give rise to the extraordinary suffering that's experienced by these hell realm beings. So there's this understanding that there's this subtle and deep relationship between the mind and the environment, the mind and the forms that the mind takes, associates with. That there's this really deep, really subtle relationship between those two things. And these energetic states of mind can give rise to these experiences. And then you've got the animal realm, which we talked about before, and that, that is dogs and cats, all the way down to fleas and worms and so on, all of these different experiences. And of course, we know that animals can't really develop their mind, they can't meditate, they can't really intentionally engage in virtue. They can engage, they can show some kindness, to their offspring, and so they can do some good deeds and so on. But really, they're not sitting there meditating on bodhicitta. They're not. So it's not a great place to take rebirth. It's not ideal. Um, and then you've got the celestial realm or the upper realm. And so these are realms that are not actually suffering realms in the sense that they um, they are not realms where the beings are experiencing suffering. They're actually upper realms. Um, and the beings there are actually, compared to the human realm, experiencing kind of better conditions. The virtue, this is one way that virtuous karma can ripen. Ordinary virtuous karma can ripen as a upper realm rebirth, but it is disadvantageous in the sense that the beings also live quite long lives. And because virtue is the origin of this kind of experience, those beings are kind of using up all of these virtuous karmic seeds during these really long lifetimes, where kind of all that's happening is sensory enjoyment. And it's also kind of interesting that the descriptions of these realms are in some ways, in a lot of ways, similar to the description of heaven from the Judeo-Christian conception, which again I think is interesting, that it's, maybe that there were also these meditative, experiences, because again, we've also experienced that. Our minds have also taken rebirth in these upper realms. Um, but we don't want to, because they kind of burn up a lot of virtuous karma, and they're just ordinary rebirths. There's nothing particularly special about them. They're not and because they are so the beings in these realms are intoxicated with the enjoyment that's happening in these realms, so they're also not practicing. They're also not intentionally engaging in virtue. They're also not really developing their mind, because they don't really see the point, because they're just, they're kind of having so much fun that why would they? if you don't ever suffer, if you don't ever see suffering, you're not really motivated to overcome it. So it's also not something that we ourselves should aspire to. Um, and we're free from it. That's why it's called the freedoms. We're not presently experiencing that kind of realm. So those are some of the freedoms. Any questions about those freedoms?
They almost seem like the human condition, almost those realms that you experience in life. So you have the hell realm, maybe great suffering in your life, and maybe you have great moments of enjoyment, and you don't worry about the karma. Seems very similar.
Yeah, certainly. There are ways I mean, from the Buddhist perspective, in a technical way, the kind of suffering that's possible in these different realms is qualitatively different than what a human is capable of experiencing. Like, um, like for example, in the hell realms, like the bodies in the hell realms can be kind of ripped apart and then they come back together and then they get ripped apart again and they come back together and they get ripped apart. So luckily we can't do that. Like when we die, like, so there's a lower limit. But yes, I mean, it's certainly true that there are sort of hellish human experiences. That certainly, some people are kidnapped and tortured or they live in war zones um, so certainly there are ways of experiencing um, corollaries or things that are sort of analogous, yeah, and that have the same, it's certainly true, yeah. So these are some other negative things that could be happening for us presently, but are not. So we've not been born at a time when a Buddha hasn't come and taught, or the teachings have died out. Um, we could have had what's called defective sense powers, or we could have what are called wrong views. So, of course, we know that Buddha Shakyamuni did appear in this world, and his teachings, when he appeared in the world, he actually taught. He didn't just kind of sit there and abide and not do anything. He gave the teachings. Those teachings still exist up to the present day. So we're free from, we could have the same exact body, the same exact mind, but on a planet where no Buddha ever came, no Buddha ever taught, or 40,000 years ago, or 10 million years ago, the Buddha, and those teachings are totally lost to history. They're totally lost to time. And that's not true of our life. Defective sense powers in this context, in some way, I think it's a reflection on, again, the time when these teachings were given, how detrimental it would be to be blind, to be deaf, at that time. But, you know, because I think 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, of course, that is much more detrimental than it is today. Certainly, a practitioner who's blind today, deaf today, is not the same. Are there some disadvantages to not being able to hear the sound of mantra? Are there some disadvantages to not being able to see the visual forms of enlightened, depictions of enlightened beings, or to see, maybe we have to say unavoidably, maybe there are some disadvantages that persist. That may be unavoidably true. Um, but I think in general, a lot of the disadvantages that are talked about are mitigated by, and of course we have more and more ways of continuing to mitigate those with surgeries and different technologies and things. But at the time, it was a big deal. And so, it was fortunate. If you didn't have that, that was fortunate. Um, and of course, it's not something that makes a person's life easier, so, and then wrong views is something that we have to think about also too in our own lives, because wrong views refers to being really closed off to the teachings of the Buddha, saying, well, the Buddha made everything up. It's not, there's no such thing. It isn't like, well, I'm not sure. I'm not positive yet. I need to study more. That's fine. Having an open mind, being, willing to investigate, being skeptical, wanting to, verify things, that all of those are great qualities to have. But if we've made up our mind and we say, well, it's all nonsense, he just made the whole thing up, then we're not going to progress in this particular path because we've decided that it's wrong. So that's what a wrong view is. It's really clinging to, um, you know, something that's contrary to what the Buddha taught, not being open to what the Buddha taught, just rejecting it completely. Those are wrong views. Any questions about those other freedoms? Okay, so those are the freedoms. Those are all of the negative things that could have characterized our lives, but are not characterizing our life. And then we have the endowments, and these are positive things that do characterize this life that we possess right now. So you have circumstantial endowments, and those refer to the world in which we live. And so some of these are just the opposite of the negative states. We do, in fact, live at a time when the Buddha has come. The Buddha has taught, the teaching still exists, and there are followers of the teachings. There are practitioners, there are, great lamas and so on in our world presently today. And there are favorable conditions. There are monasteries, there are nunneries, there are centers, there are places of learning, there are places of retreat. There are people who will, support these places of learning and so on. So it isn't like it's all underground and, it's all being actively repressed. There are a lot of favorable conditions to practice. So we benefit from all of these circumstantial or things that are about our environment. And then there are personal endowments, and these refer to our own body and mind rather than our environment. So again, we've been born human. We've been born in what's called a central land. Um, as opposed to a barbarous land. That's how they talk about it. They talk about the central lands and the barbarous regions. The barbarous regions are places where where the teachings either haven't spread or the ruler there, hates the teachings and doesn't permit the teachings. So, um, so it's important to also say that this idea, this concept of precious human rebirth or perfect human rebirth doesn't apply to anyone who's human, because we've talked about a person could be human, but no Buddha has come and taught, or the teachings don't exist. So it's really a subset of human. It's not just being human, it's a subset of being human. It's a human life that is marked by all of there's if you count all of these up, there are 18 of these qualities that between the freedoms and the endowments. So if we had been born like in North Korea or in Somalia or some other failed state, that wouldn't be a central land. That would be a barbarous region, right? It would be very difficult to hear the teachings, very difficult to practice the teachings. Even though there are other countries in the same place, the same where there are centers and where there's teachers. In our particular region, it's very difficult. It could be. So even on this planet, there are people who don't live in central lands where hearing the teachings, because the internet is suppressed and there's repression and political instability and war and strife and, very, very difficult to hear the teachings. And then we have intact sense faculties, which again is just the opposite of, and then here it says not having committed the 5 heinous actions, or also called the 5 actions of immediate retribution. And this is again sort of a technical thing, and it may not apply to all people again because um, the five actions of immediate retribution or the five heinous actions, they refer to uh, actions of the body that are intensely negative karmic actions. And they're a special kind of intensely negative karmic action where the karma is definite to ripen when a person dies in this life, um, unless it is purified, which of course is always an option, is always possible. But broadly speaking, when we commit in this life, we are creating karma all of the time, every day, right? We're doing some virtuous things, some not so great, non-virtuous things. We're being nice to this person. We're raising our voice in anger to someone else. We're creating karma all of the time. Um, and we can't say with any certainty when that karma will ripen, when that karmic seed will bring a result, except for, in terms of the teachings, except for the five heinous actions, the five actions of immediate retribution. They are said to bring their result when we die in this life. If we do this action in this life, when we die in this life, we will basically not pass go, not collect $200. We go directly to the lower realms if we commit one of these five non-virtuous actions and we don't purify it. So these five are to intentionally take the life of one's biological mother, to intentionally take the life of one's biological father, to take the life of an arhat, someone who is a Theravadan practitioner who's directly seen the nature of reality. They can be killed, and if we kill one of them, then again, direct route to the lower realms. Those three, to do what's called maliciously wounding a Buddha, to maliciously draw the blood of a Buddha. So a Buddha, because it's, the Buddha is a Buddha, but there are many, anyone who achieves full enlightenment is a Buddha. So there are, in this world, there are understood to be Buddhas present in the world. They may not be called that or recognized that like openly with that title, but there are people who've reached that stage, they are among us. Many people regard His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, as someone who is enlightened. Um, so and these people are understood not to, at least historically speaking, not able to be killed because they are omniscient. An arhat is not omniscient. They still have the obscurations to omniscience in their mind stream. That's what distinguishes an arhat from a fully enlightened being. An arhat has achieved individual liberation, but not full enlightenment because the obscurations to omniscience still persist in their mind. A Buddha has eliminated the obscurations to omniscience. So a Buddha knows if you're going to try to kill them because they're omniscient. And so they can get out of the way. They can avoid your efforts to kill them. And this idea of maliciously drawing the blood of a Buddha goes back to a story in the sutras where someone was very jealous of the Buddha and tried repeatedly to kill the Buddha. And he kept failing, but he kept trying, over and over again. He kept trying and he kept failing. At one point, he caused a boulder to kind of roll down a mountain at the Buddha. And, it was a very large boulder and it smashed, relatively. The Buddha did get out of the way. The Buddha didn't die. Um, and what they say is that this boulder smashed into, thousands and thousands and thousands of shards of rock. And the Buddha was able to track like all of these thousands and thousands and but except for one, there were just so many and it was so quick that he got a very, very small like paper cut. That was all that was the worst this person could do, was give the Buddha like a paper cut. But he maliciously wounded the Buddha. He maliciously drew the blood of a Buddha. So don't do that. Like is the, the story, like we should try not to. And of course, the problem is you don't know who is a Buddha. You don't know who is an Arhat. So it really makes it quite important not to kill people, because you're never sure, to not try to kill anyone. Um, so, and then the last is to create a schism in the Sangha. And that refers to, a Sangha here refers to a harmonious community of monks or nuns, that are kind of living together and practicing together, maybe at a monastery or a nunnery, a group of ordained, Sangha members who are working together harmoniously to achieve enlightenment. And you kind of go into that community and you spread, lies and rumors and dysfunction, and you kind of try to, split those people apart from each other. That's called causing a schism in the Sangha, or you try to convince them that what they're doing is stupid, or, you try to give them some other goal and you say, no, don't do that. You should do this, or you're doing the wrong thing. And then they abandon what they're trying to do. They abandon their seeking enlightenment. It's a very, very heavy negative karma to cause that kind of disharmony in a functional community of monastics. So those are the 5 actions of immediate retribution. So we shouldn't do any of those. And they're relatively, as long as you don't kill anyone, you know, um, they're all pretty overt things, and we just, yeah. And then it says having confidence in the teaching. So, which is again is sort of the opposite of this idea of wrong views. We have an open mind. We're, maybe we don't know everything, but we're not saying this is pointless or this is stupid or this is awful or this is bad. We have some understanding that the Buddha was, kind of onto something. What he's saying kind of makes sense, and we're interested in trying to learn more about it. Okay. Any thoughts about, I don't think we have time to go on to verse 3. Um, any questions about anything that we've covered so far? Nope. Okay. Well, we'll just leave it there for today, and we'll pick it back up next week. You may want to think about, because typically often this is a 5-week class, and we're trying to kind of get it in 4. I probably, looking at what we've covered, I'm probably not going to do that very well. So if you would be there's not presently anything scheduled for the 2nd. So you've got options. If you want to meet again on the 2nd and have a 5th class, then we'll be able to cover everything pretty well. Otherwise, I can direct you to, where you can find kind of a recording of the 5th class. But you can just think about that. You can let me know next week what you want to do. It doesn't matter to me. I'm happy to do either one. But yeah, this class works better as 5 classes and not 4. It's a lot of material to cover. Um, okay, no questions?
Yeah, I just have one question.
Uh-huh.
How do I, outside of this, how do I keep studying with this? Which books
Um,
or that?
so I mean, I think, just kind of reading anything by His Holiness, I think is a good place to start. He's got a whole series of books that start that also kind of lead a person through. That's called the Library of, let's see. So like approaching the Buddhist path, the library, it's called the Library of Wisdom and Compassion. It's a series of books, and that's the first in the series, approaching the Buddhist path. So, I mean, that's one way, if or as I mentioned, Yangtze Rinpoche is practicing the path. That's also very helpful. Um, that's just one book, whereas His Holiness is several. It's a lot of books that are kind of taking a person through this sort of same progression. Um, I would say that those are both good ways of thinking about it. Um, yeah. Okay. So we'll pick up with verse 3 next week.